There is a question that has haunted seekers since the dawn of human thought. How can God possibly hear the prayers of billions at once? How can a being so vast, beyond galaxies, be intimate enough to hear the whisper of a single heart? For many, this question remains an unsolved riddle, suspended between faith and reason. Yet Rudolf Steiner, the Austrian seer of spiritual science, offers an answer that overturns the usual picture entirely. He tells us that God does not hear us from the heavens above. He hears us from within. Steiner invites us to look not toward the distant sky, but into the very center of our consciousness. There, behind the veils of thought and emotion, lives the spark of the divine, the living image of the Creator that dwells in every human being. This is no poetic metaphor. It is a fact of spiritual anatomy, as real as the beating of the heart. The divine spark is the way God participates in us, and it is through this inner flame that He perceives our every impulse. When we pray, we do not send words upward into a void. Rather, the prayer awakens the divine ear already present in our soul. The modern world, with its glittering noise and mechanical certainties, has blinded humanity to this secret. We seek proof of God in outer signs, in miracles, or in the shifting winds of fate. But Steiner whispers a subtler truth. The divine never left. It only withdrew into the sanctum of human freedom, awaiting rediscovery. When you realize that God hears you from within, your entire understanding of prayer, destiny, and solitude changes. Imagine what it means to speak not to a distant ruler, but to the core of your own being, to realize that every time you feel heard, it is because the eternal self in you listens. This recognition transforms the act of prayer into an act of awakening. Every question you address to heaven becomes an invitation to consciousness. You no longer beg the divine to descend. You ascend inwardly to meet Him. And so the journey begins, from the outer seeking of the world to the quiet temple of the soul, where God eternally listens through the instrument of your heart. The great secret Steiner reveals is not that God comes to you when you call, but that He has always been there, hearing every unspoken word before it was ever born. Long ago, humanity did not have to search for God. The ancient peoples lived in a world suffused with divinity, a breathing cosmos where every stone, river, and breeze carried a spiritual presence. To them, the gods were not abstract beliefs, but living companions. Rudolf Steiner often spoke of this earlier stage of consciousness as the dreamlike clairvoyance of humanity's childhood. In those distant epochs, men and women perceived spiritual realities as naturally as we today perceive light and sound. Yet, as the centuries turned, something profound occurred. The divine withdrew, and the human being began to awaken to himself. The veil descended, not as punishment, but as necessity. To become free, humanity had to lose the immediate perception of God. Only through this exile into materialism could we discover the sacred power of individual selfhood, the I, or higher ego, that Steiner described as the seed of the divine within. Modern consciousness, proud and rational, calls this separation progress. But beneath our technological brilliance lies an unspoken ache, a longing for the presence we once felt but can no longer see. This is the forgotten inner temple, buried beneath centuries of external striving. We look outward for transcendence, chasing visions, philosophies, or miracles, yet the true sanctuary waits quietly in the depths of our being. Steiner explained that the evolution of consciousness was guided by higher beings who stepped back, allowing humanity to stand on its own. The gods dimmed their light so that we might kindle our own flame. This was the birth of self-awareness, but it came at the cost of forgetting the divine origin of our very thoughts. Thus, while ancient peoples knew the gods through vision, we must now choose them through understanding. The path has shifted from outer revelation to inner realization. Every soul today stands at this threshold. The outer world grows ever louder, and the inner world ever quieter, until one learns to reverse the direction of listening. Steiner reminds us that the divine did not vanish. It only changed its address. It moved from the visible heavens into the invisible core of human consciousness, and there, hidden in silence, it awaits our recognition. To remember the inner temple is to understand that prayer is not a cry to the sky, but a return to our true home. Each time we turn inward with sincerity, we step back across the forgotten threshold. The walls of the temple rise again, not of stone, but of living thought. In this rediscovery begins the new form of spirituality that Steiner foresaw, not blind belief, not mystical ecstasy, but conscious experience of the spirit within the human self. To find God again, we must learn to listen differently, not with the outer ear, but with the heart that has remembered its origin. If the divine temple is within, then how do we enter it? How do we learn to hear what lives there? Steiner teaches that the journey inward begins not with mystical visions, but with the awakening of new organs of perception, organs not of flesh and bone, but of soul and spirit. Humanity, he said, is still in its infancy regarding these inner senses. Just as the eye once evolved to perceive light, so too can the soul evolve to perceive spirit. These organs are formed through the disciplined transformation of our thinking, feeling, and willing. The first of these, thinking, becomes the gate. Most people believe their thoughts are private creations, tiny sparks flitting about in the darkness of the brain. But Steiner reveals something astonishing. True thinking is not created by us alone. It is a living current flowing through the universe, and our mind is only its instrument. When our thoughts become clear, calm, and morally imbued, we begin to participate consciously in this cosmic life of thought. It is here that the inner ear begins to awaken. This is not a metaphorical ear, but a real organ of spiritual perception. When thought ceases to be noisy and self-centered, it becomes a quiet vessel. Into that vessel can sound the subtle tones of the spiritual world. Steiner described this in his exercises from knowledge of the higher worlds. Through patience, concentration, and moral sincerity, one develops the capacity to listen to the stillness behind thought. That stillness is not empty. It vibrates with divine intelligence. Imagine sitting in silence, not to escape the world, but to perceive it more deeply. At first, all that is audible is the restless chatter of the mind, the echoes of daily life, the half-formed worries, the judgments. But gradually, if one perseveres, something else begins to make itself known, a quiet rhythm, a presence that seems to observe your very thoughts with infinite patience. That is the beginning of spiritual hearing. God does not speak in words, but in the harmonies of moral truth. The divine voice is woven into the very laws of thought itself, and only when the soul grows transparent to these laws does it begin to hear. In this way, prayer transforms. It ceases to be a petition and becomes a dialogue. The act of inner listening is the higher form of prayer, for it allows the divine will to echo within our consciousness. We no longer send questions into the void. We become instruments through which the answer resounds. Steiner often compared the human soul to a musical instrument that must be tuned. Every act of self-discipline, every honest effort to understand another human being, every moment of gratitude. All of these are ways of tuning the strings of the soul so that it may vibrate in harmony with the divine tones. When the soul is thus harmonized, it begins to perceive not with the outer senses, but through a subtle resonance that links it to the heart of creation itself. To hear God, then, is not to strain the ears, but to purify the inner life. The divine is already speaking. It is we who must become quiet enough to listen. And in that quietude, a new faculty awakens. The birth of the inner ear, the organ by which the human being once again learns to commune with the spirit that lives within all things. When Rudolf Steiner spoke of thought, he did not treat it as an abstraction or a cold mechanical function of the brain. He saw thought as something alive, a living etheric stream that connects the human soul to the very fabric of the cosmos. This is one of the most misunderstood and yet most essential insights of anthroposophy, that our thoughts are not merely chemical sparks in a skull, but waves moving through the ocean of spiritual reality. In our daily lives, thought often feels like something fleeting, almost insubstantial. But Steiner revealed that this apparent fragility is a disguise. Every genuine thought is a manifestation of the Logos, the creative word that formed the universe. It is the same divine principle that John the Evangelist described at the opening of his gospel. In the beginning was the Word. To think clearly, truthfully, and selflessly is to touch, however faintly, the same creative impulse by which worlds are born. Imagine this. Every time a human being forms a thought imbued with truth or love, that thought radiates through the subtle substance Steiner called the etheric world. It becomes a note in the grand symphony of creation. To think in harmony with truth is to think in harmony with the divine. And this, Steiner said, is one of the most sacred acts we can perform, for it allows the human eye to participate in the ongoing creation of the cosmos. What does this mean for prayer? It means that prayer is not a message launched into the sky. It is a movement within this living sea of thought. When we pray or meditate sincerely, we do not send our words outward. We align our thought ether with the current of divine intelligence that is always flowing within us. The moment this harmony is achieved, the separation between me and God begins to dissolve. The divine listens not because it is far away, but because our purified thought becomes its very language. Steiner warned that most human thinking today is dead, that is, disconnected from its living source. We treat thought as a tool for calculation, for manipulation, for control. This kind of thought, though clever, is lifeless. It severs us from the spiritual world. But when thinking is warmed by reverence, guided by moral imagination, and illuminated by love, it awakens into life again. Then, in the flow of that living thought, one senses not isolation, but communion, as though invisible intelligences were co-thinking with us. And indeed, Steiner taught that they are. There is a moment that comes to every sincere seeker, a quiet instant, when a thought does not feel mine, but feels given. It arrives complete, luminous, as if whispered by a higher source. In that moment, you experience what Steiner called inspired thinking, the recognition that the world of thought itself is a conversation between the human spirit and the divine Logos. To live in this awareness is to understand that we are never alone in our thinking. Every true insight, every noble idea, every quiet intuition is a ripple in the living ether of the divine mind. And so, when you think with clarity and love, you are already praying. When your thoughts rise in gratitude, the universe responds. When your heart moves in compassion, the cosmos listens. For the ether in which all thought moves is nothing less than the consciousness of God Himself, a sea in which every human being is both listener and participant. If the living ether of thought is the ocean in which we swim, then at the heart of that ocean burns a sun, a spiritual sun that Steiner identified as the Christ. This is not merely the historical figure of Jesus of Nazareth, but the cosmic being who entered earthly evolution to unite the divine and the human forever. Steiner's Christ is not only a savior in the past, but a living presence now, the indwelling force that awakens the higher self in every human being. Before the mystery of Golgotha, humanity's connection to the divine was largely guided from without. The gods spoke through oracles, through the rhythm of nature, through dreams. But as humanity descended deeper into material consciousness, this guidance faded. The world grew silent, and humanity stood alone. It was then that the Christ entered the earth, not as an external ruler descending from the heavens, but as a being who merged his essence with the destiny of the planet itself. From that moment onward, God was no longer to be sought beyond the stars. He had entered the human condition. Steiner described the Christ event as the central turning point of cosmic evolution. Through it, the human I, the individual self, received the seed of divinity. This means that within the depths of your own being lives a power that is not metaphorical, but real. The Christ force, quietly shaping your thoughts, your will, your destiny. It is the same divine spark that Steiner spoke of earlier, but now seen in its living activity. It is the power that can redeem the fragmentation of the modern soul, for it harmonizes all contradictions within a single luminous center. When you feel the silent pull toward goodness, when conscience speaks, when compassion arises despite all reason, these are the moments when the Christ within is listening and responding. He does not shout over the noise of the world. He whispers through moral intuition, through the quiet light that reveals truth from illusion. Steiner called this the Christ in the etheric, the new revelation of the divine presence that humanity must learn to perceive inwardly rather than through dogma or vision. This inner Christ is the bridge between the human and the divine. To believe in him outwardly is one thing. To experience him inwardly is another. The first may comfort the mind, but the second transforms the entire being. Inward experience of Christ is not bound by creed or church. It is the recognition that the source of divine love lives in the very core of one's selfhood. And through that love, God truly hears, for it is through this inner Christ that the divine consciousness perceives all that stirs within human hearts. Steiner often said that every human I is a seed of the divine I am. This is why, in the depths of prayer, one may suddenly sense not two beings, oneself and God, but one single, radiant awareness. In that sacred instant, you realize that what hears your prayer is not something external. It is the divine essence within you awakening to itself. Christ listens through you because he lives in you. This understanding changes the very nature of religion. It moves us from worshiping an external deity to living in conscious communion with the divine that breathes in every heartbeat, every act of love, every moment of truth. The God who once appeared from without now works from within, silently, persistently, transforming the human soul into his own likeness. And when we begin to recognize that this inner sun is real, the world itself starts to shine differently. Light falls through our ordinary days, not as something physical, but as a reminder of the spiritual radiance now dwelling in the human heart. To meet the Christ within, one must learn the art of silence. Steiner called this the threshold of the spiritual world, that subtle border where the noise of the outer mind falls away and the stillness of the spirit begins to speak. But few today truly know silence. We fill every moment with sound, thought, and motion. We fear quiet because it reveals what lies beneath the surface, our unspoken anxieties, our hidden doubts, the whisper of our unfulfilled longing for meaning. Yet it is precisely within this silence that the divine waits to be rediscovered. Steiner described the inner path not as an escape from life, but as an awakening within it. In Knowledge of the Higher Worlds, he outlines a simple yet demanding practice. Daily moments of quiet reflection, in which we turn our attention inward, letting thoughts settle like snow on a still winter morning. In this state, we do not seek visions or messages. We simply listen. At first, what we hear is only the chaos of our own mind, the repetition of yesterday's worries and tomorrow's plans. But if we persist, if we continue to sit with courage and patience, something remarkable happens. Beneath the restless mind, another kind of awareness begins to emerge, calm, luminous, alive. This awareness is not empty. It is the quiet presence of the spiritual world itself. When you begin to feel this stillness, you are standing at the threshold Steiner spoke of. The forces that once carried your thoughts now seem to flow from a deeper source, as if life itself is thinking through you. This is the first whisper of the divine. Not a voice, but a feeling of participation, of being gently held by a larger consciousness. Silence, then, is not absence, but revelation. It is the language of the higher worlds. The gods do not speak in words. They speak in harmonies that resound through the purified soul, and in silence, the soul learns to translate those harmonies into understanding. This is why Steiner emphasized moral preparation before spiritual practice. For only a pure heart can truly perceive the voice that speaks in quietude. Without love, silence becomes emptiness. With love, silence becomes the gateway to communion. When we cross this threshold, we begin to realize something profound. God has always been speaking. It is we who have been too loud to hear. Each act of surrender, each moment of inward stillness, clears the space through which the divine may move. And when that movement occurs, it is unmistakable. One feels no longer separate, no longer striving, but quietly aligned with a wisdom that surpasses all thought. This is what Steiner meant by living in the stream of spiritual reality. Through silence, the Christ within begins to act as the listener and the speaker. The soul becomes the meeting place of heaven and earth. Prayer becomes perception. Meditation becomes participation. You no longer ask for signs because every breath becomes a sign. The divine ear listens through your stillness, and the divine word speaks through your understanding. To practice this is to live in the midst of the world with the calm of eternity. One may walk through noise, through conflict, through sorrow. Yet within, there remains a radiant stillness, untouched by circumstance. This stillness is not an escape. It is strength. It is the power that allows the divine to work through you, silently transforming your life into a vessel of light. When silence deepens, a new kind of dialogue begins, not of words, but of being. Steiner revealed that the soul is constantly in conversation with the spiritual world, even when we are unaware of it. Every feeling, every thought, every moral impulse is a tone that resounds beyond the threshold of the visible. Just as the physical voice vibrates through air, so our inner life vibrates through the substance of spirit. It is through these vibrations that God hears us, not by listening to sentences, but by perceiving the moral music of our existence. Steiner often said that the higher beings do not perceive our words. They perceive our intentions. To them, an unspoken act of kindness resounds like a pure tone, while deceit or anger sounds as dissonance in the symphony of human life. Thus, the moral quality of our inner life is itself a language the cosmos understands perfectly. When we think and act with integrity, we are already praying. When we love selflessly, we are already speaking to the divine. This is what Steiner called the conversation of the soul. It takes place continually, whether we recognize it or not. Most of humanity speaks unconsciously, filling the spiritual atmosphere with the echoes of unbalanced desires and fears. But when a person begins to live consciously, when their thoughts become luminous with understanding and their actions guided by compassion, then the conversation becomes harmonious. The soul begins to sing in tune with the higher worlds. In this light, the question, "Does God hear me?" takes on a new meaning. God hears not what we say, but what we are. Every moment of truth, every impulse toward goodness, every silent effort to overcome ego is a note of prayer. These vibrations rise through the spiritual hierarchies. shaping the subtle worlds in ways we cannot yet see. And just as our moral tones reach upward, so too does the answering music descend. We sense it as intuition, as guidance, as a sudden inner clarity that feels both utterly our own and yet greater than ourselves. Steiner explained that this exchange forms the very fabric of karma. Each soul's moral sound weaves into the music of creation, and the universe responds in kind. What we send forth in thought and deed eventually returns, not as reward or punishment, but as an echo calling us toward balance. The divine listens through the harmony of universal law. Every gesture of love amplifies that harmony. Every act of selfishness introduces a discord we are invited to resolve. This is why the practice of mindfulness and moral awareness is not merely ethical, it is cosmically creative. To become inwardly truthful is to become musically attuned to the universe. And as this attunement grows, the boundary between praying and living fades away. The entire life becomes a dialogue with the divine, an ever-deepening conversation conducted in the silent language of the heart. When we realize this, prayer ceases to be something we do and becomes something we are. Every breath, every thought, every act of love becomes a word in the great poem of existence, a poem that God is constantly reading through us. The true question is not whether He hears us, but whether we can hear Him responding, echoing through the beauty and the sorrow, through every meeting, through every sunrise. For all of it, every fragment of our life is part of that conversation of the soul. There comes a moment on the inner path when the world itself begins to speak back. What once seemed silent and indifferent reveals itself as responsive, alive, as if the entire fabric of existence were listening and answering. Steiner described this as the law of reflection. What lives in our inner being gradually appears mirrored in the outer world. The universe, he said, is not a collection of objects, but a living conversation between spirit and matter. When we awaken the divine within, the cosmos itself becomes a mirror of that awakening. At first, this reflection appears subtly. We begin to notice coincidences, small synchronicities, patterns that seem too precise to be random. A question arises within, and soon a book, a meeting, or a line of music delivers the answer. The rational mind dismisses such events as chance, but the awakened soul knows otherwise. Steiner explained that as the higher self becomes active, it harmonizes with the etheric and astral forces around us, shaping the events of life into meaningful symbols. The world becomes a spiritual text written for our comprehension. In this sense, divine answers are not delivered from the sky, but emerge through the rhythm of our own destiny. The people we meet, the challenges we face, even the moments of silence or delay, all are responses from the cosmos to the tones we have already sent forth through our thoughts and deeds. Life itself becomes prayer answered in motion. The more conscious we become, the more transparent this conversation grows. Steiner often described this process as the transformation of the outer world into revelation. The so-called physical universe is, in truth, the body of the divine, and we, as its consciousness, are meant to awaken to that truth. When our thinking and feeling align with the moral harmony of the cosmos, the outer world ceases to be other. The rustling of trees, the pattern of clouds, the timing of encounters, all begin to speak in the language of correspondence. But this reflection is not always pleasant. It is precise. The universe does not flatter, it teaches. When discord rules within us, we find dissonance without. When we act in falsehood, confusion multiplies around us. Yet even this is grace, for it reveals where harmony must be restored. The divine answers every thought, not with words, but with experience, guiding us through the mirror of events toward ever deeper truth. Through this understanding, prayer becomes an act of co-creation. We no longer plead for the world to change. we begin to change the world from within. Every purified thought becomes a seed of light in the ether, every act of love a sunbeam reflected in the currents of destiny. God hears us through the vibration of these acts and responds by shaping the outer world in resonance with the inner one. The secret of all spiritual practice, Steiner taught, is to live in such a way that this reflection grows ever clearer, until one can look upon any moment, even suffering, and say, "Here too, the divine is speaking." This is not mysticism detached from reality. It is reality transfigured by consciousness. When the Christ within awakens, he reveals himself through the world without. The starry sky, the movement of seasons, the very flow of time, all become transparent to spirit. We begin to live in what Steiner called the spiritualized earth, an existence where matter itself becomes revelation. Thus, when we realize that God hears us through the inner spark, we also discover that we hear him through the living world. Every reflection, every synchronicity, every moral consequence is the cosmos whispering, "I am here, I am listening, and I am answering through you." As this conversation between the soul and the cosmos deepens, a new light begins to dawn within the human being, the light Steiner called the inner sun. It is not the physical orb that rises in the sky, but the radiant presence of the higher self, awakened through conscious spiritual striving. Just as the outer sun gives warmth and life to the earth, this inner sun brings clarity, courage, and compassion to the human soul. It is the same light that Christ revealed in his words, "The kingdom of God is within you." And through Steiner's spiritual science, we begin to understand what those words truly mean. The awakening of this inner sun is not an abstract experience. It begins with the simplest moments of awareness. When we pause before reacting, when we feel gratitude in the midst of difficulty, when we see another human being not as an obstacle, but as a reflection of the divine. In such moments, the higher self stirs. It is as if a quiet golden light rises from behind the storm of thought and emotion, illuminating everything it touches. Steiner taught that this light is the etheric Christ, the living presence now accessible to every soul willing to cultivate inward stillness and moral strength. This awakening changes how we meet the world. Where before we felt anxiety, we now begin to sense trust. Where we saw chaos, we begin to perceive purpose. The outer circumstances may remain the same, but the inner vision transforms them. The Christ within teaches not through doctrine, but through direct experience, that all things are woven together by the same divine law of love. When the inner sun shines, it reveals the sacred architecture behind even the smallest event. Yet Steiner warned that this awakening demands daily effort. The light within must be tended like a flame. Each morning offers a choice: to awaken mechanically to the world of habits, or to awaken consciously to the world of spirit. Meditation, moral reflection, and quiet devotion are the ways we polish the inner mirror so that the divine light may shine through without distortion. This is not about retreating from life, but entering it more deeply, armed with an inner radiance that no darkness can extinguish. Through such practice, one gradually perceives that the true temple of God is built of moments filled with awareness, compassion, and purpose. To feel the presence of the inner sun is to realize that one's own life is part of the divine evolution of the earth. The human being, Steiner said, is destined to become a bearer of light, not metaphorically, but in the most real sense. The spiritual sun that once shone upon us from without now seeks to shine through us from within. And when that happens, prayer and action merge. Every deed done in love becomes a ray of the inner sun extending into the world. Every thought held in truth becomes a beam that enlightens another soul. The divine ear, which has always heard within, begins now to speak through our actions. We become instruments through which the cosmic harmony is renewed. To live in this way is to experience what Steiner called spiritual confidence, the serene knowing that one is never abandoned, that every difficulty conceals an opportunity for light to reveal itself. The awakened human being does not escape the storms of life, but walks through them with the calm of one who carries the sun within. In that light, the question, "Does God hear me?" fades away, for the answer radiates from within. I am heard, because I am part of the listening itself. At last, when the light of the inner sun shines steadily, the human being begins to experience what Steiner called the eternal conversation, that unbroken communion between the divine and the human, which has existed since the beginning of time. It is not a dialogue of words, but of being. The divine listens and answers through the pulse of our existence, through every experience, through every breath we take. When we awaken to this reality, life ceases to be a chain of random moments and becomes a single unfolding revelation. To live in this awareness is to stand at the center of a vast spiritual symphony, in which every soul is both an instrument and a listener. Our joy, our sorrow, our striving, all form part of a divine composition whose purpose is love. Steiner often said that human evolution is not complete. We are still being written by the word of creation. God does not stand apart, observing us from afar. He evolves through us. Every time a human being acts out of truth instead of fear, love instead of hatred, a new tone is added to the cosmic harmony. The divine becomes more present in the world through our awakening. In this way, we discover that God has always been within, hearing through our conscience, speaking through our intuition, and living through our deeds. The veil that once separated heaven and earth begins to dissolve. To pray is to think in harmony with the cosmos. To meditate is to listen to the breathing of God within the soul. To love is to allow the divine to recognize itself in another. The boundaries between the human and the divine fade into a living unity. Steiner foresaw that this would become the next stage of spiritual evolution, an age when humanity would no longer depend on outer authority or dogma, but on direct inner experience of the Spirit. This is the true freedom of the modern soul, not rebellion against the divine, but conscious cooperation with it. To find God within is to become responsible for His presence in the world. Every word, every thought, every gesture becomes a channel through which the eternal conversation continues. And so, the path that began with a question, "How does God hear me?" ends with an answer that is also a transformation. God hears us through the spark of His own being that lives within. We hear Him through the awakening of our higher self. The prayer we whisper and the answer we receive are two sides of one eternal act, the divine knowing itself through the human heart. As you walk forward from this realization, do not imagine that the journey ends here. Each day offers a new opportunity to deepen the conversation, in silence, in thought, in love, in the smallest acts of kindness. Practice awareness. Practice stillness. Let your inner sun rise each morning and shine into the world. In doing so, you become part of a great chorus of awakening souls, each discovering that the voice of God was never distant. It was their own deepest self speaking all along. If these words have stirred something within you, a quiet recognition, a longing to listen more deeply, then you are already part of this living dialogue. This is not merely my message or Steiner's message. It is the message of the Spirit within you. Share your reflections, your questions, your experiences of the divine presence in your daily life. Let this be a shared path, a common journey of remembrance. Subscribe, not just to the words, but to the practice of listening. Share this light with others who seek it. Together, we keep alive the ancient truth made new again, that God is within us all the time, and that is how He hears us,